Hello everyone, welcome back. This week, the global energy system has been shaken by a series of major developments, and at the center of it all is world geopolitics. Starting from last week, we have seen conflict in the Middle East, rising oil prices, disruption in gas markets, and major resource investment in Africa. Taken together, these developments tell us something important. Energy markets across the world are interconnected and are usually shaped by politics, security, country interest, and strategic competition. So today, we will walk through some of the major energy developments happening around the world and provide some insights, context, and what they mean for governments, investors, and citizens. And we'll start with the war in Iran, which is the biggest geopolitical development affecting global energy markets right now. The war involving Iran, the United States, and Israel, and the impact on other countries. Now, to understand this conflict, we need to look at what was happening before the war actually broke out. In the weeks leading up to the escalation, negotiations were still underway between Iran and Western representatives over Iran's nuclear program and regional security concerns. Diplomatic talks had not completely collapsed, and there were indications that further discussions would continue. Even Donald Trump acknowledged that negotiations were still in progress shortly before the military action began. However, that diplomatic process ended abruptly. On February 28, 2026, the US and Israel launched large-scale military operation against Iran, known as Operation Epic Fury. The strikes targeted Iranian military infrastructure and senior leadership positions across the country. One of the most dramatic outcomes of the initial strikes was the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Ayatollah Khamenei, along with several senior figures in Iran's military and security establishments. The operation was designed as what military strategists call a decapitation strike, an attempt to remove the political and military leadership of Iran in order to weaken the regime and disrupt its command structure. Why the war, and what was the rhetoric that fueled the conflict? For decades, tensions between Iran, the US, and Israel have been shaped by extreme hostility. Iran's leadership and affiliated groups have repeatedly used slogans such as "Death to America," "Death to Israel," which US officials cite as evidence of long-standing hostility towards both countries. American political leaders have often pointed to these statements as part of the justification for confronting Iran's government. When announcing the military operation, President Trump said the campaign was necessary to eliminate what he described as an imminent threat from Iran's missile and nuclear programs. He argued that the Iranian regime had spent decades supporting militant groups and threatening US allies in the Middle East. Trump framed the campaign as a decisive move to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and to dismantle its military capabilities. In his public remarks after the strikes began, he warned Iranian forces to lay down their arms or face devastating consequences. At one point, he said that Iranian military forces should surrender or face certain death, adding that combat operations would continue until US objectives were achieved. Now, how did Iran respond? Iran responded almost immediately. Within hours of the strikes, Iranian forces launched ballistic missiles and drones targeting Israel and US bases across the Middle East, marking a rapid escalation. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian issued strong political statements in response to the attack, rejecting calls for surrender and insisting that the country would continue resisting foreign military pressure. The president said Iran would defend itself against foreign aggression. In other words, Iran's message was clear. They would not retreat, they would not surrender, and the conflict would be met with force. The leadership question inside Iran after the strike was clear. The killing of Ali Khamenei created a major leadership crisis inside Iran. Khamenei had ruled the country since 1989 and was a central figure in Iran's political and religious structure. Few days ago, the country's political establishment, the Assembly of Experts, appointed a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the former supreme leader, just over a week after his late father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed by the United States and Israel joint strike. Khamenei received immediate backing from figures in Iran's political and security establishment, including IRGC's leader, President Masoud Pezeshkian, and the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. The US and Israel are obviously not pleased with the new leader. President Trump has insisted he must have a say in the selection of the leader, while Israel believes that the new leader will carry on in the path of his father. Now, why does this matter for the global energy system? I will explain very quickly why energy markets reacted so quickly to this conflict. Iran sits next to one of the most important energy corridors in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow waterway. Major oil exporters such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates depend on this corridor to ship energy to global markets. With the breaking out of the war, markets immediately started pricing in the risk that oil shipments could be disrupted, and indeed, they have been disrupted. Oil prices have surged because traders fear that tankers moving through the Gulf could become targets and that shipping routes could be temporarily closed. For governments, this raises very serious concerns about energy security and inflationary pressures. For investors, it introduces major volatility in the oil markets. And of course, for ordinary citizens, this eventually would show up as higher fuel prices, higher transportation costs, and rising energy bills. So, while the conflict may look like a regional military confrontation, the economic consequences are global, and energy markets are responding accordingly. And next, we will dive a little deeper into the scale of the current energy shock, and at the center of this is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway between Iran and Oman is arguably the most important energy shipping route in the world. On a normal day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz, which represents about 20% of global oil consumption and a significant share of LNG exports around the world. Now, that means crude oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates all move through that same corridor before reaching global markets. So when Iran declared the route closed in response to the conflict, the consequences were immediate and global. The first impact was on shipping and logistics. Hundreds of oil tankers suddenly found themselves unable or unwilling to transit through the strait, with many ships anchoring outside the Gulf, waiting for security guarantees, as Iran had said it would blow up any oil vessel found in the area. Shipping companies quickly suspended new bookings, and several vessels began diverting routes where possible. But here is the problem. There are very few alternative routes. If tankers cannot pass through the Strait of Hormuz, then they must either wait or take dramatically longer routes around Africa, adding 10 to 14 days of travel time and significantly higher fuel costs. Now, that slows down global oil supply chains and effectively reduces available shipping capacity. In logistic terms, it is similar to closing a major highway that carries a fifth of the world's traffic. The logjam would be severe. Next is the impact of the closure on insurance costs and risk premiums. Shipping in war zones requires specialized war risk insurance, and once the conflict escalated, several major maritime insurers withdrew or sharply increased coverage for vessels operating in the Gulf. War risk insurance premiums jumped from about 0.2% of a ship's value to as high as 3% within days, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of each voyage. For large crude carriers transporting millions of barrels, the additional insurance alone could easily run into millions of dollars per shipment. Cost increases obviously doesn't disappear. It will be passed down the entire supply chain and ultimately becomes part of the price of delivered oil. Once markets realized the straits could remain closed or restricted, oil prices reacted immediately. Benchmark Brent crude surged towards the $19.93 per barrel range, and by Monday, 10th March, had risen to $120, the highest since 2022, before receding to an average of $90 per barrel. It remains unclear what prices will be in the coming days as the war unfolds, as traders will be pricing in the risk of prolonged supply disruption. Already, Iran has insisted it will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed and has demonstrated its resolve by bombing some merchant ships in the area. This is despite threats from President Trump. Now, to cushion the impact of high crude oil prices, 32 nations of the world has announced on March 11 that they would release a record 400 million barrels of oil from their emergency reserves to limit oil market shortages. How has petrol prices reacted across the world? Unsurprisingly, the effects of high crude oil prices are already impacting consumers through higher fuel prices at the pump. In the US, for example, gasoline prices rose sharply to $3.59 per gallon by March 11, rising 62 cents from February 28 prices of $2.97. In Nigeria, petrol prices at the pump pushed above 850 naira per litre to about 1,002 naira per litre on the average. The Dangote refinery recently held a press conference a few days ago stating that it is not immune from the global impact of the war in Iran and that it will prioritize product supply to Nigeria at reasonable prices, subject to commercial viability. In the UK, petrol prices have hit their highest in more than 20 months this week, with prices increasing by 6.12p and 12.7p per litre since Saturday, February 28, when the war began, rising to about 138.96p per litre of unleaded petrol and 155.12p per litre of diesel at the pump. Why does this matter? The price impact on consumers shows how quickly geopolitical events can have real economic consequences on transport costs, airline and shipping costs, food and commodity prices based on inflationary pressures. So while the conflict may appear geographically distant from many consumers, the economic impact travels very quickly through the global energy system. And our third story for this week will be on Qatar LNG declaring force majeure. The war has also triggered a major disruption in the liquefied natural gas market. State-owned Qatar Energy, which operates the world's largest LNG export system, halted production at key facilities and declared force majeure on several export contracts after attacks on energy infrastructure at Ras Laffan Industrial City. A force majeure declaration essentially means the company is temporarily unable to meet its contractual delivery obligations because of events beyond its control, like a war. This is a major shock to the global gas system. Qatar supplies roughly 20% of global LNG exports, and most of those cargoes normally move through the Strait of Hormuz before reaching buyers in Europe and Asia. Both Shell and Total Energies have also declared force majeure on their LNG contract commitments. Both have long-term partnerships with Qatar Energy and are partners in the company's enormous North Field expansion project, which aims to boost production capacity by 2027. As soon as these force majeures were announced, the immediate reaction across importing countries was a scramble for alternative supply. In India, for example, which relies heavily on Qatari LNG for electricity generation and its industry, gas supplies to some industrial consumers have already been curtailed as authorities conserve available volumes. Across Asia, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Bangladesh, buyers have rushed into the spot LNG market to secure replacement cargoes. The result is intense competition for available supply as countries now look to alternative exporters such as the United States and Australia to fill the gap, although spare capacity in the global LNG market is limited. In Europe, the reaction has been slightly different. Direct reliance on Qatari LNG is small, but the region is still vulnerable because Asian buyers bidding for replacement cargoes are now competing with European utilities in the same global market. Some European countries have already begun seeking additional gas supplies from other regions, including African producers, to reduce exposure to this disruption. The impact of the scramble for alternative gas supply is immediate. Spot LNG prices in Asia have surged very sharply. Tanker freight rates have jumped, and traders are warning that if the disruption persists, the market could experience a shock comparable to the 2022 European gas crisis. Again, this volatile and premium gas supply will translate into higher electricity prices for households and industries around the world and increased energy security concerns. We move straight to Nigeria on the landmark settlement of the OPL 245 dispute. The Nigerian government has announced a resolution of the long-running dispute over OPL 245, one of the most controversial licensing cases in the history of the global petroleum industry. This was announced last week by the president after a meeting attended by Eni and Nigeria Deep Exploration Limited. The story goes back more than 2 decades. In 1998, during the military government of Sani Abacha, The block was awarded to a little-known Nigerian company called Malabu Oil and Gas. The company was widely reported to be linked to former Petroleum Minister Dan Etete, who had previously served under the government at the time. The license was later revoked in 2001 by the government of Olusegun Obasanjo, triggering a series of legal battles over ownership of the block. A decade later in 2011, the dispute appeared to be resolved when Nigeria approved a deal under which Shell and Eni jointly acquired the block for about $1.3 billion. However, most of that payment was routed to Malabu as compensation, which later became the central issue in a global corruption investigation. Prosecutors in several jurisdictions, including Italy, the United Kingdom, and Nigeria, alleged that the transaction involved large bribery payments to Nigerian officials and intermediaries. This led to years of litigation involving multiple parties, including the Nigerian government, Malabu, Shell, and Eni. Criminal trials and civil suits followed in different jurisdictions, although a number of the key defendants were eventually acquitted in high-profile Milan court proceedings in 2021. Despite the legal battles, the block itself has remained undeveloped, and that is significant because OPL 245, often associated with the Zabazaba Etan discovery, is believed to contain around 9 billion barrels of recoverable oil resources, making it one of the largest undeveloped deep-water discoveries in West Africa. Nigeria is now exploring a settlement arrangement or a framework aimed at finally unlocking the potentials of this block. According to the president, this resolution sends a clear signal to global investors that Nigeria is prepared to address legacy issues transparently, uphold the rule of law, and create a stable environment for long-term capital. Under the proposals, the government plans to split the license area into two separate blocks, allowing different investors to develop different sections of the acreage. The idea is to resolve overlapping claims while still enabling development to proceed. The President's Special Advisor on Energy, Oluwarewolu Verhinjia, said that by resolving the OPL 245 dispute, the federal government has removed one of the most prominent legacy risks in Nigeria's upstream sector and reinforced its commitment to predictable regulation, transparent governance, and commercially viable investment framework. With this agreement in place, it could allow development of the field to move forward after more than 2 decades of disputes. For Nigeria, the implications are significant. First, development of OPL 245 would attract billions of dollars in investment, particularly in deep-water infrastructure. Secondly, it would send an important signal to international investors about Nigeria's willingness to resolve legacy disputes in the oil and gas industry. And that matters at a time when global oil companies are becoming increasingly selective about where they deploy their capital. For Nigeria, unlocking major offshore reserves is not just about oil production, it's also about government revenue, foreign exchange earnings, and restoring confidence in the country's upstream investment environment. And finally, for this week, we'll talk about the Rio Tinto moves to restart long-stalled projects in South Africa. And this is another important development in the resource sector, which involves Rio Tinto, as previously mentioned, that is planning to revive a $473 million investment in a mineral sands project in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The project is linked to the company's Richards Bay mineral expansion, one of the world's largest mineral sands operations. Mineral sands are strategically important because they produce materials such as titanium dioxide feedstock, zircon, rutile, ilmenite that are used in the manufacture of paint, sunscreen, and smartphones, advanced manufacturing outputs. However, the project did not progress as originally planned. The expansion was halted in 2021 after a series of serious security incidents and violent community conflict around the mining area. Tensions between local community groups, contractors, and mining interests escalated, disrupting operations and making it difficult for the company to safely continue development. As security concerns mounted, Rio Tinto suspended planned expansion and reduced activity in the area, while negotiations with government authorities and local communities continued. What has changed now is that South African authorities and community stakeholders have reportedly reached new security and engagement arrangements, giving the company greater confidence that the risk around the project can be well managed. That is why Rio Tinto is now preparing to restart the investment. For South Africa, this project will deliver several economic benefits, including new employment opportunities in the mining region, higher mineral exports, increased activity in the country's mining sector, and for Rio Tinto, the project is strategically important because mineral sands are part of a broader global race for critical minerals. These minerals are essential inputs for a wide range of technologies, from aircraft components to wind turbines and advanced industrial materials. So the decision to revive the project signals something broader. Major mining companies still see Africa as a key frontier for critical mineral development, even as they navigate complex political, social, and security challenges on the continent. And that is it for this update, which is a good reminder that wars, sanctions, global logistics, security, and political decisions can shape the flow of energy around the world, and how consequential this may be for everyone, irrespective of where they live. Now, if this update has been useful to understand the issues more clearly, kindly subscribe for more deep dives into global energy and fiscal reforms. I am Babatunde, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.